There you go. There's the tip off. All right. So we have a great set of work sessions this morning that I really look forward to. And I do believe we're going to start with the East Fork Lewis River, and we have a lot of dignitaries in the audience. Kevin, are you going to take it?
Yes, I'll take it off. Good morning. For the record, Kevin Tyler, Lands Manager with Clark County Public Works. With me today, we have Danielle Cowley, our Lands Coordinator. We also have with us today the sponsor of the project, the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership. And representing the partnership, we have Carrie Dupler, Principal Restoration Ecologist, and then in the audience, Jasmine Zimmer-Stuckey, Public and Legislative Affairs Manager. Our team this morning will...
and the Director of the Lower Columbian Fish Recovery Board.
Oh. and yes, we have Steve Manlow as well. So our team this morning will each take turns with portions of the presentation. Next slide, please. Today we'll provide a comprehensive overview of the East Fork Lewis River Reconnection project, including a look at the current plans for each project location and recent updates. We will discuss several important aspects of the project, the access agreement for construction, the use of timber from legacy lands, Estuary Partnership's approach to community engagement, and the proposed timelines for various project phases. This briefing aims to give you a clear picture of the project status and plans moving forward, ensuring that all key stakeholders are aligned on the project's direction and upcoming milestones. With that, I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Good morning, Council. Danielle Calvey, Parks and Lands. So, next slide. So this slide shows you some key components of where we are today in terms of timeline. Since 2012, Clark County has collaborated closely with Estuary Partnership to enhance the ecological health of the lower East Fork Lewis River. The county has backed the partnership's proposal to develop restoration design and implementation for several miles of the river in the Ridgefield Pits location area. They have aimed to improve aquatic and riparian conditions. To support this initiative, grant funding has been allocated for design, permits, and construction. Additionally, Clark County Legacy Lands just acquired Ridgefield Pits, so that shows that we're demonstrating our commitment to fixing this watershed. And this unlocks $20 million in grant funding, which is about 3,000% of our investment for this Ridgefield Pits acquisition. Next slide. So this map showcases all the Legacy Lands acquisitions over the course of the time. So all the acquisitions we have are in blue, and then the red is the brand new Ridgefield Pits acquisition. We have our first purchase in the East Fork of Lewis River was in 1993 at the Center Bottoms, and we have acquired over 4,000 acres within this watershed for protection as well as wildlife corridors and habitat. There is a long-term goal to do a trail from Paradise Park, so on the left, all the way down to Louisville Park near the 503 on the far right side at some point. That would be about 10 miles of a trail, passive recreation trail. Next slide. So I think we get down to the why are we restoring East Fork of the Lewis River, right? There's quite a few key components of why we are in this position today. The primary goal is to return the river to historic conditions and return the ability for fish for spawning habitat as well as other ESA-listed species, endangered species, and to also connect a wildlife corridor. Next slide.
I'd just like to add, I think one of the main components that is different or distinguishes this project from others that are like it, other fish habitat projects, is that is the floodplain component. We had the large funding from Floodplains by Design, and so there's an element of reducing erosion risk at county property, moving critical infrastructure out of the floodplain, and also improving flood protection for downstream landowners.
Good morning, Council. I'm Carrie Dubler with the Estuary Partnership. The Richfield Pits project is one part of a long-term collaborative effort to preserve and restore floodplains through the restoration of both riverine processes and then to aid with salmon recovery in the East Fork Basin. Dyer Creek and the Ridgefield projects are kind of outlined here in red, and they span from about river mile 6.5 to 10. As you can see, these sites serve as a major extension of the dozen or more downstream projects that have been completed or are currently in development. Next slide. There are 4 key project locations or zones. Starting from the downstream, we have Dyer Creek, we have the Ridgefield Pits or the core pits area, and then we have the County Daybreak Shed Yard area that also includes Danger Park and a portion of the Columbia Land Trust property. And then on the far upstream side, we have the Lower Daybreak Trail, Daybreak Park area. So the benefits associated with this restoration project are wide-ranging, and they include ecological benefits, local dollars invested in the community, and long-term recreation opportunities for the community. The ecosystem benefits from the restoration of floodplain processes, which support improvements like groundwater recharge. A study that was produced by the Department of Ecology showed that this section of the East Fork is what is called a gaining reach, meaning that cold groundwater flows into the river. So by recharging groundwater through those reconnected floodplains, we can help alleviate some of the warm water conditions in this section of river. For reference, this section of the East Fork is listed as a TMDL by the Department of Ecology for warm water, so it is a major issue that threatens species. Reconnecting the floodplain also increases the flood storage capacity, which helps to reduce that flood intensity, like Kevin said, and it minimizes bank erosion and helps with stability issues that are prevalent within this reach. A restored multi-thread system will also help the development of the spawning and rearing habitats for salmon, steelhead, and lamprey. The East Fork supports 5 Endangered Species Act listed salmonid species and lamprey, and it has been designated a wild steelhead gene bank. It is critically important that we recover the system for salmonids, and in this reach, warm water temperature and the lack of suitable habitats continues to impact the recovery of these species. The Department of Ecology produced the East Fork Alternative Restoration Plan in 2021, which was built upon earlier versions, and it outlines the measures that aid in salmon recovery and addresses temperature issues within the basin. The Ridgefield Pits and the Dyer projects are 2 projects that are specifically listed as essential to meeting these goals in the basin. And as Danielle mentioned, the Estuary Partnership, in coordination with project partners, have secured $20 million for this restoration project, all of which will be invested locally. The property serves as a key link in that Greenway Trail, and the project designs provide flexibility for a future alignment of the East Fork Greenway Trail through the property. So as we move through the project zones, at the far downstream side, we have the Dyer Creek project. This area is mainly focused on restoring the connection between Dyer Creek and the East Fork Lewis River to provide off-channel access to salmonids. As you can see in this picture here, during higher flows, this area is subject to erosion. It's actively eroding the roadway, the county's roadway, and it's impacting the riparian plantings that were previously installed. When we zoom out, you can see here in yellow is the project area. There are a few sections along the East Fork Lewis River. In these areas, we will remove around 1,200 feet of riprap from the riverbanks that have been in place for over 50 years. These areas would be supported by large wood structures that provide bank stability and will also provide in-channel habitat for fishes. Moving upstream on Dyer Creek, a 10-foot by 6-foot box culvert will replace an existing 2-foot culvert, which serves as a barrier for fish passage and can become plugged during high flow events with debris. Additional planting in these areas will help extend that riparian buffer and provide more shade along Dyer Creek and along what would be a future trail alignment. Moving upstream, the Richfield Pits, or the core pits area, is comprised of the river and the 9 gravel pits in this reach. As you can see in this picture, the river meanders through these pits and they act like warm water ponds in the summer months. The goal in this reach is to restore a multi-threaded river and wetland complex similar to the channels that are observed on the GLO Government Land Office maps from the early 1900s and late 1800s. Because of gravel mining and then subsequent erosion, the floodplain is largely disconnected except during high flow events. So by filling the pits, we will reduce the warm water sources and reconnect the floodplain and a series of channels at lower flows. Throughout the project area, floodplain reconnection will create around 37 acres of additional flood storage. This is going to help reduce erosion along the banks and downstream near the power lines, the airport, and it will reduce downstream impacts for several miles. Wood structures will provide bank stability against erosion and will also help to increase salmonid and lamprey habitat diversity within the river. This area will also be treated for non-native species like blackberry and Japanese knotweed, and then after construction, native riparian and wetland plants are going to be installed. Farther upstream, we have the Daybreak Yard area, which includes the county's yard as well as portions of Danger Park and the Columbia Land Trust property. Next slide. In this area, levee removal and relocation of the storage portion of the yard outside of the flood zone will protect the infrastructure and increase the flood storage capacity. The yard is currently located in the 20 to 50-year flood zone, and by moving it to the east, we'll move it into the 100 and the 500-year flood. The old yard area will be converted to a wetland alcove area, and then it will expand the riparian corridor along this side of the river. And then last, around River Mile 9.5 to 10, we have the Lower Daybreak Trail region, which includes a portion of the pedestrian trail and the shoreline within the park. As you can see in this picture, in this area, shoreline erosion is threatening the power pole that is adjacent to the river, and ultimately the river will impact the trail if this is left unchecked. In this area, the trail and the infrastructure would be moved back a little way off of the river, and then a high water alcove will serve to increase the flood capacity while providing long-term protection to this portion of the trail system. Native trees and shrubs along this portion of the new trail alignment will provide a bit of habitat diversity and beauty in this portion of the trail alignment, and it can serve as an educational opportunity for the community to learn about the native plants, and it's going to help bring that riparian zone closer to the accessible trail.
The county and estuary partnership have been negotiating an access agreement that will come before council in the coming month to 2 months that will specify all the provisions for which the estuary partnership will have access to the county property to construct the project. We're talking about work hours, Monday through Friday, typical construction schedule, 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Work will also be allowed on Saturdays to make sure that the construction can be completed within the in-water work window. That construction on Saturdays will run from June 1st through September 30th, and there will be no work on Sunday, holidays, or outside those above listed hours. We'll talk about the construction schedule on a coming slide. We want to talk about the contribution of timber to the project. So the project needs approximately 2,700 logs, some of those with root wads. The estuary partnership has sourced logs from multiple locations, some donated, some as mitigation from another agency. And to keep the project within budget, the county and the estuary partnership have been discussing the provision of some logs from the county's upcoming Spud Mountain timber sale. The exact details of that are still being refined, but the basic concept is that the county would transfer logs from one Legacy Lands property to another Legacy Lands property to be used in the project. We think this is a benefit because it's a sustainable source of wood for the project. Normally, a project would be bid and the contractor would be responsible for obtaining those logs. They could obtain those from any source, and that may not be a similar sustainable source like the county's timber management policies under Forest Stewardship Council and Sustainable Forestry Initiative. So exact numbers will be included in the access agreement that comes before council in the coming months. And
Pause on that for a
Yeah.
second, because you called by a specific name. Is that the Camp Bonneville?
it is not.
It is not.
It is not.
So is that part of the plan? Because we had just no? I just, for transparency.
Sure.
I mean, all of these proposals, and I was going to touch on it later, on the log, is everything's more complex than
Yeah.
you might realize, especially on the specifications on the log. But there was some discussion of part of our ongoing logging efforts at Camp Bonneville to provide a stream of logs to this project as well. Is that part of it, or?
It is not.
Okay.
So we did look at both Spud Mountain and Camp Bonneville as a source of logs for this project because we are putting out a timber sale hopefully at the end of this year, and it will include about 100 acres at Spud Mountain, which is a separate property, and then some additional acreage at Camp Bonneville. We don't feel that it's appropriate to take logs from Camp Bonneville to allocate to the project because the intent of the forest stewardship plan at Camp Bonneville is to reinvest revenue from those logs back into the property. And we know that there will be needs for that property in the near future. So Spud Mountain felt like a better fit. But we're still looking at the exact numbers. It depends on how many logs the Estuary Partnership is able to obtain from outside sources through donation and other sources, and then how many are remaining needed and how much we can afford without impacting our Spud Mountain project negatively. And we also wanted to touch on outreach today. So the Estuary Partnership has taken the lead on outreach for the project, and you may see email updates from them. There's a project website. There's a listserv where they send out routine updates on the project, like the recent Ridgefield Pits acquisition by the county was sent out on that listserv by the Estuary Partnership. There are regular news releases and press releases, and then also meetings with legislators. And we have Jasmine in the audience if there are specific questions or additional information that you need about outreach. And then as we get closer to construction, that outreach will ramp up and there'll be additional information for the community. Next slide, please. So this slide is intended to show you the general timetable for construction and activities associated with the project. So currently, the design is being finalized, and the Estuary Partnership is starting the pre-qualification of bidders process, and also attempting to procure some of those materials like the logs. The bid will go out later this year. The request for bids and construction is intended to start in 2025, with construction going through 2026. Some of the conditional activities that we see up there, including ongoing weed control, maintenance of planting, survival monitoring, things of that nature, are dependent on the Estuary Partnership obtaining additional grant funding. So we're hoping that that works out. Next slide. And then just to summarize the next steps that we see coming, the access agreement we're working on that. That'll be coming before council in the next 1 to 2 months. As I mentioned, the request for qualifications, that pre-bidder qualification has been issued by the Estuary Partnership. Release of the bid is scheduled for September 23rd, with, I believe, bid award by late November, early December, and then construction starting as soon as April 15th. That's when the in-water work begins. And that concludes our presentation. We want to thank you for your time today, and we're here to answer questions that you have.
Okay, well, thank you for your time today and for the participation. There's only 3 of us on the council today, so what I'd like to do is, first and foremost, this is an important project. And as the presentation showed, you considering everything in the project, and it just barely skims the surface of how complex all the work was that went into this. And I mentioned the logs. You know, I've been randomly sending out emails to those in the timber industry, the ports. Hey, do you have some logs? I had no idea that you actually had specifications on what those logs would be. And so I'm glad that you've been forward thinking on all these issues and putting so much work. You know, Sue, Marshall, and I actually testified at the legislature to try to get over the hump and get us above the cutoff with the state, and we were able to, with the help of many others, push that through. This is such an important project, from providing protection of our own public works facility to local farms and other residences there, to the airport, which is also an important facility that will provide some relief. But fish recovery obviously is foremost, and I know we had a lot of public comment at the Lower Columbian Fish Recovery Board on whether this should be a single channel effort or multi-floodplain kind of approach to it. And that was an education process for me, because some of those constituents were pretty adamant that they were right, that this needed to be a single channel. And as a layperson, I thought, well, boy, that makes sense. Yeah, great. But until then I heard from Steve Manilow and others and got educated, started looking at the Columbia River itself and other rivers and the natural courses that they do follow. A very complex path is the right way headed. So I am very appreciative of all the work that you're doing and that this is finally moving forward. I want to, because there's only 3 of us, I want to first go to online. And Karen, did you have questions for any of the participants, including out in the audience? We could have them come forward if we need their input. Go ahead, Karen, please.
My question deals with the Ridgefield pits. You mentioned the terminology, fill the pits, and I wondered what you meant by that. Or maybe that was just a misnomer, but what did that mean?
So as part of the excavation and the rebalancing of the floodplain on the site, part of the higher portion of the floodplain and some of those relic levees that have, are scattered across the property, will all be regraded, and in some sections, the pits will be filled so that their bottom is brought up to an elevation that is consistent with the channels as they go in, or maybe a little higher in some areas where they'll serve as sort of wetlands between riverine channels. So they will be filled with native soil and rock from the area.
Very interesting. And do you change access to the pits at all?
There will be a smaller channel that will run on the west side, just right kind of near the power line right of way. That will not change access to the property. It will actually probably make it will look nicer eventually, and it will actually probably make it easier for people to get down into the river, since right now those pits are giant ponds surrounded by blackberry that are, you know, almost impossible to cut through to get to the river.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I just must say that I think that changing the course of waterways is just a fascinating thing to do, and very difficult actually, because it has a momentum all of its own. So I appreciate what you're doing, and thanks for your report today.
Thank you, Karen. Sue, Marshall?
Yes, thank you. I feel lucky to be serving on the council when this project is all coming together, because it's taken really such a very long time. And I want to commend the partnership really for the courage and vision to take on something as complex and difficult as this. So I don't know of any other group that would be able to do that. So thank you for all your long-term efforts on that, and to the county as well for having the long-term vision of the greenway for the East Fork. The East Fork is really a treasure for Clark County, and I think particularly important steelhead gene bank. And I think for, you know, the largest steelhead was caught in the East Fork, and I think you had to be one tough steelhead to make it up the East Fork. So it's just great to see all of this coming together. I did have a couple of questions, so I wanted to follow up on any legislative issues that might be before us, because I understood we have full funding right now to complete the project, but would there be additional legislative issues or grants or funding that we should be aware of, or you'll keep us posted?
We do currently have funding to complete the construction of the project. We are seeking additional funding, as Danielle said, for some of those conditional work on the back end, so some additional interplanting and monitoring. None of those would impact the implementation of the project at this time, and we'll keep you apprised if there's any changes.
Great. And then I did hear from some of those constituents who I think care very deeply about the East Fork, and I think it is kind of counterintuitive to think that, you know, because they were advocating for one deep channel, you know, as a way to address temperature and things like that, but it seemed kind of counterintuitive. No, you need to have it spread out. So could you speak to that a little bit in terms of how your restoration plan will is a way to address temperature?
So I will preface my comment with, I am not a hydrologist. I am an ecologist, so I look at the bugs and the bunnies. But the idea around this is that originally the East Fork through this section was a meandering riverine system. It's mapped as such on several rounds of mapping from the 1850s to the early 1900s. The river moved around a lot. Old channels became oxbows that you can see farther downstream. And so the system was dynamic and changed a lot. So our goal is to restore to the best ability possible what was there before in this reach. The main stem itself is not going to be rerouted. The main stem channel will be rehabilitated, so we will kind of bring up some of those deep sections and add more riffles and things that the fish like, but the main stem will stay in its current alignment. What most of the work will do is take those levees and the higher floodplain portion and fill the channels and then regrade some additional channels both on the east side and the west side of the main stem to provide those additional channels on the floodplain. And then, the idea is that the area in between would be a matrix of wetlands and some small upland areas, and that the river is allowed to move within this sort of zone. That's kind of been one of the big things with the pits. It's prevented the river from being able to move around. So the goal is to have a system that is a restored channel migration zone as well within this corridor.
And then just one final comment. I think this all can also serve as a cautionary tale of what it takes really to correct for some of the past mistakes, thinking that we were doing the best we could at the time, but now knowing that it was really damaging. So I think it's a cautionary tale to look forward because it takes a whole lot of effort to bring a river back up to its functioning condition. So thank you all.
So I'm going to mix some comments with questions, and I'll just segue off of what Councilor Marshall said, because there are some active pits there now, and I'm not sure I'd characterize it as a cautionary tale, but we got to stop building gravel mines right in fish-bearing rivers. I mean, that, Karen Bowerman mentioned changing the course of the river. Well, it's artificially been changed because of that gravel mining, and it's just a scar. So one, they shouldn't have been abandoned, and I'm hoping that with the pits that are active now, they won't be just abandoned. They'll be recovered and restored properly. So mixing that question in, will this restoration work help protect the existing pits so they're not inundated by a 500-year event, so we have a whole other group of pits that become a killing field for salmon there? So will this benefit? I can see the benefit to the airport to kind of take the stress off of that bend in the river there, and the farmlands and homes and our public works. That's obvious. But what about the existing active pits? Are they going to receive any benefit from this?
So the engineers of record for the project have conducted extensive analysis looking at potential effects on the stored all pits area that are there to the north. As part of the modeling for our project, we looked at different scenarios of placing wood and floodplain roughness in different areas. One of the reasons that the channels don't get too close to the stored all side is so that we do not encourage the river to move into those pits. So the riparian corridor that exists currently between the two pit sets would stay in place, largely in place. We've preserved large swaths, even with work in some areas of that corridor. And then along some of the channels that run towards the stored all area, we would be putting additional wood and other habitat structures in place that provide floodplain roughness to help slow the water down, spread it out, and prevent erosion and potentially another avulsion of the river in that zone.
So going back to the logging issue, do you think you have a solution in place once you get the agreements done where you don't need further donations, or does the hue and cry still need to go out to the timber industry and those people cutting down timber? Do you still need donations outside of what you propose as a solution of the 2,700 logs?
I think we don't know exact numbers of what the Estuary Partnership is obtaining yet from these other sources. And so I'd say it's probably still a little bit of an influx. But the county's Spud Mountain project it could potentially produce enough to cover the additional needs that they have. So I would say donations are helpful, and the Estuary Partnership would love to have those. But I think we have enough in place that it can work.
Okay, and so just lastly, for me, not really a question, but a comment. I mean, I refer to it as a killing ground. I mean, it is a scar. It's been there for quite some time, and between the temperature killing off our fish, you have predatory birds, it's fishing in a barrel, bullfrogs, you name it. This is to restore it, to protect it, which is a high value area. The Reconnection is so important, whether it's the creeks that feed Lake River to Lake Vancouver. And I think, is it Mason Creek the other project? I know it's not directly related to this, but certainly pretty contiguous. Is it Mason Creek that's part of the estuary additional project? And can you just, I guess that is a question, can you touch on what that additionally will add in that very high value area for fish recovery?
Yeah, so the Mason Creek project is further downstream from Ridgefield Pits near the power line bend and the airport that we've been talking about. And the county and the Estuary Partnership partnered on a grant a few years ago to acquire, so the county acquired some property on Mason Creek, and the Estuary Partnership was developing conceptual plans. We've gone through a couple rounds of that, and we're working with the community in that area, presenting to the other landowners adjacent to Mason Creek what that concept looks like. And I think there's a grant application in it, or did you hold off on the grant? So we're looking at that as a future project, assuming we can work with the community out there and come to a project that everybody agrees would be a benefit.
Okay, thank you for that. So forward-looking, and Steve, that was the project. I just couldn't remember the name of Mason Creek, because there's lots of grant programs out there for fish recovery. Anyway, any last questions by Karen or Sue?
No.
We look forward to the groundbreaking and further progress, and this is great work. It's going to benefit, it's going to hit on a lot of cylinders as far as protecting the environment, property rights, and of course, fish recovery. Thank you so much for the time this morning. We really appreciate you coming down.
Thank you.